Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the session today about equity, inclusion, and social justice from the system change lens. My name is Ana Maria Bustamante. I'm the coordinator of the Burnaby Intercultural Planning Table, or Burnaby Local Immigration Partnership. I also coordinate the Burnaby Together Coalition Against Racism and Hate. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to recognize that we are hosting this session on Coast Salish territories on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Halkomelem and Squamish speaking peoples, where we are grateful to the opportunity to hold this virtual meeting in this shared territory where we develop the work, we learn, and enjoy the benefits of this land. This week's session is hosted in partnership with the Burnaby Intercultural Planning Table and by Burnaby in the North Shore Immigrant Inclusion Partnership, or North Shore LIP, the Surrey LIP, and the Tri-Cities LIP. We do our work with service providers, including settlement service organizations, local employers, municipal entities, the RCMP, provincial ministries, educational institutions, and community organizations serving newcomers, with the goal of enhancing engagement, planning, and coordination of the newcomer settlement and integration efforts to make all these communities more welcome and inclusive for all. Some guidelines for today's session. The session will be a 2-hour session, including a Q&A. This event is being recorded, so you won't be seeing yourself in the cameras because this is hosted as a webinar. We ask you all to keep your microphones off, and the recording will be shared along with an evaluation after the session. Please use the chat or type your questions or reflections or comments that may arise during the conversation today. I will be monitoring the session, and we also have a graphic recorder that will capture all the details of the conversation. I'm going to make a pause here and take a moment to see who is in the room with us today. I will invite you all to please use the chat and share with us where you are joining us from today. Feel free to include details about the place, the location from which you are calling today, and your organization affiliation, if you feel comfortable doing so. Today, we're coming together in this virtual space to explore the topic of equity, inclusion, and social justice from a system change lens. If there has been a time for system change leadership in grappling with complex issues of racial equity and justice, is now. In addition to this, the proportionally negative impacts of COVID-19 pandemic experienced by BIPOC communities, we are also contending with climate emergencies, compromised food systems and food chains, and the growing burden of mental health problems and a rise of precarious work. Rather than trying to tackle problems one by one, today's complex issues require urgent action at a systems level. Systems thinking practices and tools can help us understand the intersecting root causes of problems and begin to develop more generative visions for the future that shift power and center race, visions that include a strong focus and anti-racist equity-oriented strategies. I would like to introduce the moderator for today's conversation, Nareen Gill, and she will, following that, she will introduce the presenter. Nareen is the Executive Director of Burnaby Family Life, host of the Burnaby Intercultural Planning Table, and brings over 25 years of senior leadership experience to the social services sector. She has spearheaded several advocacy initiatives with the Tri-Cities and has worked with various municipalities in the development of their strategies. Nareen works to bring forward issues and concerns as well as possible solutions through her active participation across various municipal, regional, and provincial platforms. She is collaborative in her approach and works to build community relationship vested in the shared purpose of overcoming challenges and improving community practice and services. Nareen has a passion for social issues impacting communities based on her training as a clinical counselor and previous experience of working alongside other service advocates. Nareen.
Thank you, Anna Maria. It is an absolute privilege to be here on day 2 of conversations on anti-racism. For those of you who joined us yesterday, we had a wonderful conversation with Len Pierre, and we're extending that conversation today with our key guest speaker for this morning, Candace Knoll. Candace Knoll is a life member of International Training and Communications and a past president of the Pacific Northwest region. She has achieved her skilled communicator status and is a certified trainer in public speaking. Candace placed third in the International Speech Contest in 2013 and has been part of the communication training team for the Miss BC pageant for over 10 years. She also conducted the public speaking training and was a pageant MC for Miss Africa Vancouver in 2017. Candace is a member of the United Steelworkers Local 1944 Unit 51, a past chair, a shop steward, a counselor, member of the local civil and human rights and bargaining committees, as well as a member of the United Steelworkers National Anti-Racism Working Group. She is a New West District Labor Council delegate, a former board member, a political action committee member, a Joy Langdon Women in Leadership Scholar recipient, and a 2020 Elsie Award winner. Candace has over 20 years of extensive labor training. As treasurer for the National Congress of Black Women Foundation and a member of the Anti-Racism Coalition of Vancouver, Candace is passionate about taking the skills she's attained to educate, promote the advancement for the betterment of our community by reestablishing the Junior Black Achievement Awards. Today, Candace will take the time to lead us through her presentation. My ask to the audience is any questions or reflections that you have, please use the side chat. After Candace completes her presentation, we will have our graphic artist who is going to be documenting today's session present what she has found visually to the team, and we will then go into a question ask period of this session based on what is posted in the chats. So welcome, Candace. I will pass the floor over to you.
Candace, you're muted, sorry.
There we go. Thank you so much. I just want to thank you for the opportunity, giving me this opportunity to present at the conference this week. It was very powerful yesterday, and I know it's going to be a very emotional week. It'll be a week of understanding and learning, but it's very necessary that we do this education and that we have the difficult conversations. So my intention today is to review so we can look and we can understand where we came from and what we need to do together to move forward to create a socially just future. I'm just going to share my screen with you here. And there and share. All right, so hopefully everyone can see it okay. Action is the only remedy to indifference. Elie Wiesel. To create an equitable and just future, people need to take action to achieve system change. We need to remember where we came from. We must look back to move forward. Recognizing our civil and human rights, it is vital that we understand the importance of equity, inclusion, and the need to change. When we look through a systems change lens, we can analyze how society has developed the disparities between the groups of people. We can then begin to challenge and dismantle racism in all its forms. We are all entitled to certain civil rights by virtue of being a citizen of a certain country, nation, or state. Civil rights are in place to protect a citizen from discrimination and to grant them certain freedoms in that nation. For example, free speech, freedom from discrimination based on human rights grounds such as national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, marital status, family status, generic characteristics, or a disability. Now, these rights are decided between governing bodies and their citizens, and then they tend to protect a citizen's freedoms to do things. Human rights are the most fundamental rights every person on earth should have and cover the basic necessities of human existence. So some examples of rights afforded to everyone equally include the right to life, the right to education, and the right to be protected from torture. That's not always been, but these rights are absolute in nature. The world's first charter of human rights was created by Persian King Cyrus the Great in 539 B. It was called the Cyrus Cylinder. The Magna Carta of 1215 was created and made it so that the King of England was subject to law. So it basically laid the foundation for parliament and constitutional government. Now, as countries began to explore and settle in the new world, the conquering of this land brought the colonization that we still experience today. And we see this as we look through our history. For an example, King Henry VII of England referred to the land discovered by John Cabot in 1497 as the Newfoundland. In 1535, two Aboriginal youths told French explorer Jacques Cartier about the route to Canada. They were actually referring to the village of Stadacona, and that's the site of the present-day city of Quebec. So for lack of another name, Carter used Canada to describe not only the village, but the entire area controlled by its chief, Donnacona. The name Canada likely comes from the Huron Iroquois word Canada, meaning village or settlement. So by 1547, designated everything that was north of the St. Lawrence River as Canada. By 1616, although the entire region was known as New France, the area along the Great River of Canada and the Gulf of St. Lawrence was still called Canada. The name Quebec comes from the Algonquin word for narrow passage or strait. It was first used to describe the narrowing of the St. Lawrence River near what is now called the city of Quebec. It wasn't until the British enacted the Constitution Act of 1791 that Ontario would be known as the land upstream from the St. Lawrence River, or Upper Canada, and Quebec was considered the land downstream from the St. Lawrence River, known as Lower Canada. So I was able to trace one side of my family history to the settlers of Algonquin. In the 1800s, the Six Nations of Indians in Ontario that were loyal to the Crown were granted land. Mohawk Chief Joseph Brant was given a tract of land that stretched 6 miles wide along each side of the river. Well, Brant gave his daughter Elizabeth and John Morey, her first husband, 200 acres of land where he and his Indian followers settled. So I am African American Canadian, but I am also a descendant of Chief Joseph Brant through his youngest daughter, Elizabeth Brant's first marriage. Elizabeth's first husband was a Black free man. They had 8 children, and one of them was the son, Charles. Charles married, and they had Agnes. And Agnes married my great-grandfather, Andrew Brown, on my father's side. Well, history is not sure where Elizabeth was born exactly, so I am either 5th generation Canadian, but possibly 6th. In different documentations of Canadian history, I see how this history is altered. Her connection to a Black community has attempted to be erased. The side that is idolized in history is her second marriage to William Kerr, grandson of Sir William Johnson, who's a landowner and military officer in the Mohawk Valley. Their son later became a Mohawk chief. In the Black culture, the females are the matriarchs in the family. And I believe this to be true in the Indigenous as well, as I learned in a presentation the other day. The women are the keepers of their culture. While preparing for this education, I Googled the definition of Métis. And it said, typically, when written in small m, Métis refers to any community of European Indigenous ancestry, including those in Ontario and Quebec and non-status settlements near First Nations reserves. It is often used to describe mixed descent families and communities during the 18th and 19th early century Great Lake fur trades. Now, although some scholars do avoid using that term. By the definition, European Indigenous ancestry, part of my existence is being denied. When I look up Elizabeth's history, I see the attempt to erase the Maori line as she was brought into the colonization fold. I read a story that the family lived on Algonquin lands. A soldier had approached them and told them that the deed to Brant's property was not valid. He assured him that they would take the deed, or he would take the deed to the proper authorities and return with legal documents. Well, guess what? That man was never seen again, and some years passed, the land was sold and the Maoris were forced to move. Currently, there is a pending land claim that covers a territory of 36,000 square kilometers in Eastern Ontario, an area with more than 1.2 million people. I think you'll remember a couple of years ago where there was that terrible dispute. In 1831, government sponsored residential schools to assimilate Aboriginal children into Euro-Canadian culture. The Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario, accepted its first boarding student in 1831. The residential schools continued to operate for 165 years. The last one closed in 1996. September 1st is National Truth and Reconciliation Day, a statutory holiday to give society time to reflect. I thought it was 3,200 Indigenous bodies have been recovered to date, but I learned yesterday it's more around 9,000. So I went looking again to update my presentation. And of course, you can't get an exact number unless you start doing all of these additions so readily. So again, it's like there's a little bit of erasure or silence that's happening in this terrible tragedy. But 9,000 Indigenous children's bodies have been recovered to date from what I learned yesterday. So as Canada grew, we saw the provinces' names, the areas, everything's just losing their Indigenousness as the land was being taken away. 1833 brought the British Empire abolished slavery. More than 800,000 enslaved Africans were freed in the Caribbean, US, and some in Canada. And on August 1st, 1834, slavery was abolished in Canada and other British colonies. August 1st is Emancipation Day. Now, it's not a stat holiday. Ontario, the country's largest province, and Nova Scotia, home to the historic Black community, are the only provinces that formally recognize this day. I made a note that Sir James Douglas, the first governor of BC, was a Black man. But we don't celebrate Emancipation Day here. So I thought I would learn a little bit more about Sir James Douglas. Well, he was born in 1803 in Guyana. His father was John Douglas, a Scottish planter and a merchant from Glasgow, in business with his three brothers. The Douglas family were part of the business elite of Scotland. His mother was Martha Ann Nee Ritchie, and she was classified as a free colored. She was a woman of Barbadian and Creole ancestry. Well, in that time and place, it meant that if someone was of mixed African and European family history, they were not enslaved. In 1828, Douglas and Amelia Connolly, and she was of Métis and Cree status, they were married on April 27th and then repeated that ceremony 10 decades later when they were in Fort Vancouver. So just before the Civil Rights War in April of 1858, Douglas was instrumental to the resettlement of 35 African Americans. They were fleeing a life of racial persecution in San Francisco, and they arrived in the province aboard a steamship Commodore, which was later known as the Pioneer Committee. In 1963, Douglas was crowned by Queen Victoria for his services to the crown. He served from 1851 to 1864. The Civil Rights Movement was from 1861 to 1865. My great-grandmother, Emma Lane's nephew, was the first Black man to serve a full term in the United States Senate. His name was B.K. Bruce, and he represented Mississippi from 1875 to 1881. He was good friends of the civil rights activist Frederick Douglass, and in fact, he was the best man at his second wedding. There are two books that I know of published about his life. One is called From Slave to Senator by Phyllis Appel, and the other is called The Senator and the Socialite by Lawrence Otis Graham. His brother, Henry Bruce Clay, wrote a book that was titled 29 Years a Slave, 29 Years a Free Man. When the riot on the White House was happening last year, on the news, we saw some film footage of rioters that were running up some steps to an office. Well, behind them was the portrait of B.K. Bruce. I was so grateful that they didn't actually stop, take a look at that picture, notice it was a Black man, and defame it. Through the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, Jim Crow's laws and discrimination were deeply entrenched societally, systemically, institutionally, and scientifically throughout the Southern states especially. BK lost his seat in 1881, but he was appointed Register of the U.S. Treasury, which placed his name on all U.S. currency. He served from 1881 to 1885, and then again from 1895 to 1898. The British North America Act of 1867 was the creation of the Dominion of Canada to attract farmers to Canada's Western Prairie region. The government implemented homestead legislation in 1868, which provided free land for immigrant settlers. In 1878, this legislation was revised and called the Dominions Land Act. But as laws were enacted to protect the rights of some, we must remember the Indian Act of 1876 was created to restrict the rights of others. During the time of free land being offered, many African Americans fled the Jim Crow laws of the South for free land in the North. And some of those were my mother's side of the family. In 1909, they migrated from Oklahoma by way of Emerson, Manitoba, to Maidstone, Saskatchewan. My great-grandfather, Julius Caesar Lane, and his wife, Emma Bruce, who is BK's auntie, and 12 other families created the settlement of Eldon. Our church has been designated as a historic site. We were referred to as the Shiloh people. World War I was from 1914 to 1918. Now, the servicemen, they came home to find their families in worse condition than they had been before they were enlisted. Many were poor, they faced overcrowding and harsh living conditions. My Grandy Brown was wounded in battle, sent home back to Ontario, and he was never able to collect a pension. The Spanish flu broke out, and the people in Winnipeg's North End were hit hard. The unions fought for equality and human rights issues like medical. More than 30,000 workers walked off the job. The Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 struck a significant blow to workers' rights, but they didn't see it as a failure. Scientific and systemic racism is weaved throughout our history. In 1835, enslaved people were freed, but Dr. Sims, the godfather of gynecology, was practicing his experiments on enslaved Black females in Alabama without the use of an anesthetic between 1835 and 1849. The Tuskegee Project in Alabama started in 1932. Black men were used for 40 years to study the natural effects of untreated syphilis. It lasted until 1972. Black men were seen to be more fit for slavery because of their physical strength and their simple minds. Black people have a primitive nervous system, so they don't experience pain like white people do. Fast forward to 2017, Serena Williams almost lost her life after giving birth to her daughter by cesarean section. An article on Vox discussed the issue about how Black women have a higher mortality rate than white women with the same medical issues. What happened to Serena Williams after she gave birth to her daughter demonstrated how society dismisses Black women's needs. In 1939 to 1945 was World War II. we know that as many 30 experiments were performed on concentration camp inmates by German physicians from 1941 to 1945. The world came together and the United Nations was formed in 1945 to maintain international peace and security, developing friendly relations among the nations, achieving international cooperation, and being a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. In 1946, Viola Irene Desmond, a Canadian civil and women's rights activist, businesswoman of Nova Scotian descent, challenged racial segregation at a cinema in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. She refused to leave a whites-only area of the Roslyn Theatre. We call Viola our Rosa Parks of the civil rights movement, and we honor her today with her picture on the $10 bill. In 1947, the Declaration of Helsinki, which is a set of ethics and principles regarding human experimentation, was developed for the medical community. It is regarded as the cornerstone document on human ethics research. The Declaration of Human Rights, led by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, was adopted on December 10, 1948, International Human Rights Day, to provide for the rights and freedoms of all. The civil rights movement between 1954 to 1968 was an uproar of solidarity in response to the structural, scientific, institutional, and societal racism. People, organizations, churches, and unions created a movement for equality and social justice. The Montgomery boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks in 1955, the Freedom Riders of 1961, the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, all played a part in demands, and the demands for equality, democracy, and a call to end racial segregation and discrimination. John F. Kennedy recognized the importance of becoming an ally to the Black community. He campaigned on civil rights and support for the space program. In the spirit of diversity, equality, and inclusion, he had NASA appoint Edward Dwight to become the first Black astronaut in 1961, until he was not. President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. The very next day, Dwight was shipped to a training facility in Germany that never existed. He resigned from the Air Force in 1966, claiming that racial politics had forced him out of NASA and into regular Army Corps. In August 2020, Dwight was made an honorary Space Force member in Washington, D.C. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended discrimination in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, is considered one of the crowning legislation achievements of the civil rights movement. In December 1966, King argued for a rebalancing of physical priorities away from America's obsession with the Vietnam War and towards greater support for anti-poverty programs at home. He led his first anti-war march in Chicago on March 1967 and reinforced the connection between war abroad and injustices at home. February 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. It has been said that the Vietnam War was used to distract from the civil rights movement. The Vietnam War was fought from 1955 to 1975 and helped to radicalize American African servicemen. The war coincided with the protests of the civil rights movement, and the Black soldiers embraced Black power culturally and politically. Now, although 1 million African Americans that served in the war thought that they were fighting for their emancipations and their belief in democracy, but they were in fact still denied the most basic of human rights. My family moved from Winnipeg to a place called Danville, Illinois in 1970. I was in grade 3, and I really didn't understand the dynamics in the USA, but I had that feeling it was different. It was very different. When we see, or what we see in the Ukraine right now during this time of crisis, is societal and systemic discrimination. Social media is bringing it to the forefront. People are aware, they're talking and educating. We must look back to move forward. Canada has had its own history of discriminatory practices. The Chinese head tax was enacted between 1885 and 1923. It was the first legislation to exclude immigration based on ethnic background. With the completion of the CP railway, the Chinese labor was no longer needed. In 1911 to 1924 was to be proposed a 1-year prohibition of Black immigrants entering Canada, because according to the Order in Council, the Negro race was unsuitable to the climate and the requirements of Canada. During the 1900s to 1960, Canada accepted about 21,500 immigrants from Caribbean countries. The slight increase in immigration from 1945 to 1960 corresponded with the post-war economic expansion and the West Indian domestic scheme from 1955 to 1967. So that scheme was established almost exclusively for the immigration of women from Jamaica and Barbados who immigrated as domestic workers. Jean Augustine, the first Black female MP and cabinet minister, entered Canada through this scheme. The Komagata Maru incident involved the Japanese steamship on which a group of people from British India attempted to immigrate to Canada in April 1914, but most were denied entry and forced to return to Calcutta. There, the Indian Imperial Police attempted to arrest the group leaders. A riot ensued and they were fired upon, and it resulted in 22 deaths. In May 1939, German Jews fled Nazi Germany. The MS St. Louis sailed to Havana, Cuba, but that country's government refused them entry, although they had visas. The US and Canada also blocked them, denying those passengers safe haven. The ship was forced to return to Europe, and 254 of the refugees later died in Nazi concentration camps, perhaps by some of those experiments that we talked about earlier. From February 1942 to 1949, the Japanese were exiled to 12,000 camps in remote British Columbia areas and elsewhere. The National Film Board documentary, A Road Taken, by Selwyn Jacob, highlights the Porter story about working conditions and opportunities of Black people that immigrated to Canada. One of the decent jobs that was available to the Black man was that of the sleeping car porter. Now, due to the servitude nature, it was seen to be ideally suited for the Black man. They were able to make a decent living and provide for their families, but they had to endure less than desirable working conditions. In 1955, it was my great uncle Lee that led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters out of Winnipeg in their battle for the rights of the Black workers. They took on CN, CP Rail, and their union, and in 1967, they won their fight to end the racialized discrimination among the Black union workers. So I do hope that you'll take the opportunity to watch The Road Taken. His daughter, my cousin, Val Williams, is a diversity and inclusion facilitator at the University of Manitoba. She says inclusion is a right, not a privilege. So I have referenced some of her work building this presentation. So as the United States continues to make improvements to their Civil Rights Act, in 1967, Canada also dropped its racially discriminating immigration system. 1982, the Canadian Constitution was renamed to the British North America Act, and this now includes the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Canada's history is founded on 200 years of enslavement of Black people and the cultural genocide of Indigenous people. This colonial mindset is deeply ingrained in our psyche. Racism is a public health crisis, and people, organizations, businesses, politicians, and communities need to see it as such and act. In the words of Senator Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard, if the Canadian government and people are serious about tackling racism at home, then it's time we started treating this health hazard like the crisis it really is. Racism is a virus. Dr. Bernard is a first full-time professor at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia. Racism hurts. It's important as a society that we take the opportunity to learn and understand the importance of equity, inclusion, social justice, and how we can make a difference by understanding our past. To create an equitable and just future, we must look back to move forward. In an article titled Common Ways White People Harm Black Folks by Salem Debs, she talks about the language we use as being rooted in historical context. We are socialized beings and conditioned with constant messages from the media and our environment that shapes how we see the world and our positionality. She believes that you are either communicating in anti-racist ways or racist ways, whether you know it or not. Language is very powerful. Language does not describe reality. Language creates the reality that it describes. It's a quote by Desmond Tutu. Deb suggests decolonizing your language. Immigrant versus migrant. Understanding that we are all on stolen land. All residents, including white people, are immigrants and settlers. Asking people to shorten their name is rooted in a colonial mindset. Can I call you Jay for short? No. Try phonetically to see it. Write it out and practice enunciating it. This will help you to become more respectful. The term slave versus enslaved. People were enslaved. They were not slaves. Slave reduces the people to a non-human noun. The indigenous children were recovered, not discovered or found. They were never lost. They were taken. Do not use third world country or marginalized people. Instead, say overexploited or disenfranchised. Do not describe a Black person as articulate or well-spoken. What you are saying is that you are surprised that they have a particular set of linguistic skills, which is code for sounding white. Calling a Black person aggressive or angry is rooted, deeply rooted in racist beliefs. Whiteness and white dominant culture are rooted in protecting the identity of whiteness, which is thought of as universal, the benchmark, human, normal, and innocent. When white people are defensive in a conversation around race, they are protecting a long-held legacy of colonial and hierarchical beliefs stating whiteness is inferior and anything divorced of this is inferior. Deb refers to it as white innocence or defensiveness. So listed are some of the examples of how it looks in real life. I'm afraid of offending someone. That's white innocence. There is no way my daughter is a racist. That's white exceptionalist. Are you calling me a racist? White defensiveness. I haven't brought up racism with my family because I don't want to ruin Christmas dinner. That's white comfort. My Black friends have never shared any instances or issues around race or racism. That's white fragility. If you could just share your thoughts kindlier, maybe you could reach more people. That's white comfort. This reminds me of that experiment where people are asked to stand in a straight line and then advance either forward or backwards, depending on the answer to the question. Well, I find it a racially discriminating exercise that uses racialized people to educate the privileged. We already know, for the most part, who's going to wind up at the back of the room. The responses I have received at the suggestion that it was a racially discriminating exercise were those of signs of white fragility and defensiveness. Another way that Black people are harmed, according to Salem Debs, is when you ask Black people to educate you on racism. When white people ask Black people to educate them, what they are saying is racism is not their problem. They believe they're helping Black people instead of dismantling an issue that white folks historically created. Asking a Black person to educate you one-on-one is an emotional labor, and it's traumatizing towards Black people. It is work to be the only Black person in an organization bearing the weight of all of your white coworkers' questions about Blackness, and they're oblivious to the daily harm that they inflict. It is work for Black people to do the labor of pointing out problematic racist thinking, policies, actions, and statements while desperately trying to avoid bitterness and cynicism. It is essential for white folks, organization, businesses, and municipalities to educate themselves by hiring Black educators in anti-racism and anti-oppression work to build a sense of accountability, a shared language, and a say in cultural, politics, and practices. When you become educated, the burden is lifted from Black individuals to educate you on white dominant structures. Bringing up Black Lives Matters and your corporate anti-racism statement to your Black employees assume that they want to talk about racism, not realizing how vulnerable and unsafe it is for them. This conversation is more about companies looking good, not doing good. Racial discrimination is entrenched in our systems. Practices and laws based on scientific, systemic, societal, and institutional racism are flawed. Indigenous, Black, and racialized children, youth, and families have a right to live in safety, dignity, and respect, adds Rachel Gowen, Executive Director of the Child Welfare League of Canada. Redirecting resources to meet the needs of families is not only the right thing to do, but also the most effective way to ensure that every child can fulfill their potential. Economic discrimination against Blacks and Indigenous children threaten the very survival of these communities through robbing them of a future generation, which is as healthy, educationally accomplished, and occupationally successful as Canadians in general. This cannot be tolerated, said Sid Frankel, Associate Professor of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. In two of Canada's largest cities, far more than half of all persons living in poverty were from racialized groups, 58% in Vancouver and 62% in Toronto. Indigenous people are overrepresented among the homeless population in virtually all urban centers in Canada. 28 to 34% of shelters are Indigenous users. 1 in 5 racialized families live in poverty in Canada, as opposed to 1 in 20 non-racialized families. Racialized women living in poverty were almost twice as likely to work in manufacturing jobs than other women living in poverty. And overall, racialized women earn 32% less at work. September 2013, according to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, 4.3% of the Canadian adult female population are Indigenous, and they make up 41.4% of the female adult federal inmate population. 3% of the Canadian adult female population are Black women, and they represent 9.1% of the federal adult female inmate population. So together, the Indigenous and the Black females represent just over half of the incarcerated women in the federal prison system. As of May 2021, 12.8% of men that identified as Black had an incarceration rate of 4,109 per 100,000. 58% identified as white, and they had an incarceration rate of 771 per 100,000. and 28.9% that identified as other had an incarceration rate of 1,507 per 100,000. Black males 18 to 34 years old are incarcerated 7,000 to 100 versus white males at 1,400 to 100,000 in the same age range. Shame. February 2022, the Black population is 3.5% of Canadians and 7.2% were in the federal prison system, which is down from 10%, which I had found it was a few years ago, 2010. So that's progress. As of January 2021, the unemployment rate among Black Canadians rose to 13%, 11.6% Indigenous, while the unemployment rate in non-Black Canadians was 7.7%. Overall, the demographics and statistics are alarming. It saddens my heart and deepens my passion to follow in the footsteps of some of my ancestors by providing human rights education and becoming an activist for social justice. We need to look back to move forward. We need to take action to make change. There is a Strathcona unsung hero that worked with uplifting the Black community financially. He is featured in the YouTube video, Who is Leonard Lane? Well, I've shared with you about my family ties to Chief Joseph Brant, told you about Senator B.K. Bruce, and my great-great-uncle Lee, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in Winnipeg. Well, now this is about my cousin Leonard. Leonard is Emma Lane's grandson. He was a key member of the BC Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1950. One of their ideas was to start a credit union. And in 1959, he was one of the founders of the BC Unity Credit Union. Leonard set up an office in his basement of his Burnaby house to help Black families buy their homes in the Lower Mainland. Well, by 1971, that credit union merged with Van City. He really made a difference in our community to help uplift our members. Looking back at history, the lack of equity and the lack of inclusion still happens today. But we must risk and persist. We must continuously work towards challenging and dismantling racism. We must recognize the importance of having representation, inclusion, to ensure that there is a social justice in our society. As a union worker, I understand the collective power and the desire to uplift one another. The civil rights movement was a historic example of people pulling together in solidarity for the greater good of all. I am very proud to chair the organizing board to revitalize the Junior Black Achievement Awards. We are currently working with the United Way and partners to bring back this much needed scholarship program and education initiative for the youth in our community. Looking at our history, we need to level that playing field. The opportunity for advancement, the quality of education, as well as access to affordable housing are all contributing factors that will determine the overall success of a racialized group. And we see through history that racism operates on an individual level, which stems from conscious and unconscious prejudices. It is reinforced by systemic, institutional, structural, and scientific racism. The formalized set of institutional, historical, cultural, and interpersonal practices within a society that place one or more social or ethnic group in a better position to succeed and disadvantage other groups. So ultimately, disparities will develop between the groups. We have seen this repeatedly throughout our history. Laws and regulations made through a society or an organization can lead to issues such as discrimination in the criminal justice system, employment, housing, political power, and education, among other issues. Through their policies and practices, an organization can create a culture, or they can perpetuate a position of relative disadvantage for racialized people. Ensuring a fair and unbiased decision-making by involving people from different ranges of backgrounds and of different genders or sexual orientation, for an example, will offer diverse equity and inclusion, which provides a greater opportunity for overall fairness at the table to be achieved. Recognizing this need, Coquitlam City Councillor Trish Mandello founded Synergy on Boards. It is a consulting group that is dedicated to creating a pool of experienced Black, Indigenous, and other racialized groups that are board ready for organizations to have access to. So where do we go from here? The challenge of the 21st century is not to demand equal opportunity in the machinery of oppression, but rather to identify and dismantle those structures in which racism continues to be embedded. Angela Davis. Intention versus impact. It's important to consider what your intention is versus your impact of your actions. In the YouTube video, Where Are You From? Created by Ken Tanaka, begs the question, what does that question even mean? It assumes that you are from somewhere other than where you are at that particular moment. It doesn't ask if the assumption is correct. It avoids asking the important question. Was the intention to find out the cultural heritage, or was it to find out where she was born? Can you imagine living with these types of interactions every day? I hope that you'll watch that video and notice how she reacts to his questions. Analyze what you think that fella's intentions were. What do you think he meant by "Your English is perfect," followed by him saying, "Where are you from?" How do you think each of them felt after their meeting? So I hope that you will take the time to go watch that video. It's quite enlightening. Some people live every day of their lives with microaggressions. Microaggressions are defined as the everyday, subtle, intentional, and often unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias towards historically marginalized groups. Racial microaggressions to me would be like you don't act like a normal Black person, or what do you think your people think about that, for an example? We can talk about, or when we talk about definitions, and in racism, race is actually the narrow view. It's based on similar physical and biological attributes. It is a social construct way of classifying human beings based on identified or perceived characteristics like skin color, and informed by historical and geographic context. In the theme of decolonizing your language, use racialized as opposed to visible minority groups or people of color. In an article by Constant Gray on Vox.com, June 2020, regarding the term BIPOC, she describes the acronym as an attempt to center the voices of Black and Indigenous, but using this term indiscriminately carries its own problems. Adrian Dixon, professor of critical race theory at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, says that it's an attempt to be inclusive of the histories of oppression, but terms like BIPOC come with a loss of nuance. People want to be named and recognized, not amalgamated. You are erasing cultural differences when you lump racialized people together. Each are victims of colonization, but the genocide of the indigenous people versus the enslavement of the African people are two very different issues. And the term BIPOC is erasing our individual cultures. Ethnicity is more of a broader view, and it's based on cultural expression and place of origin. It is the fact or state of belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition. There are 6 classifications listed in the USA Federal Database on race and ethnicity: American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian, Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white. While many nations in Africa, Asia, and South America can claim literally hundreds of distinct ethnic groups within its border, the US Census only recognizes the 6 ethnic categories. Equality. Equality means that each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. Racial equality occurs when institutions give equal opportunities to people of all races. In other words, regardless of physical traits such as skin color, institutions are to give individuals legal, moral, and political equality. Although equality focuses on everyone getting the same opportunity, it often ignores the realities of historical exclusion and power differentials among whites and other racialized groups. Equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. Racial equity is a process of eliminating racial disparities and improving outcomes for everyone. It is the intentional and continual practice of changing policies, practices, systems, and structures by prioritizing measurable change in the lives of racialized people. Diversity includes all the ways in which people differ. It encompasses all the racial identities or characteristics, personal experiences, values, and worldwide views that make one individual or group different from another. Racial diversity is the acknowledgement and celebration of differences between racial groups. And finally, inclusion is the act of creating an environment in which any individual or group can be and feel welcomed, respected, supported, and valued to fully participate in all opportunities afforded. Are you not racist or anti-racist? Is a list by Cedrulo Marusco, and it highlights the differences. So let's review some of these comparisons. So being not a racist is afraid of discomfort, where an anti-racist would embrace discomfort. Not a racist, you watch things happen, a spectator of what's happening, where an anti-racist speaks up against, they are a doer. Not a racist, unaware of personal biases. An anti-racist is aware of and they're fighting against biases. Not a racist, just uninterested in justice for others. An anti-racist fights for justice in all its forms. Not a racist, passive participant and beneficiary to a racist system. Anti-racist is an actor, dismantler, outspoken critic of a racist system. And finally, not a racist, part of the problem. Anti-racist, part of the solution. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi defines a racist as a person who upholds the system of unequal power and views one race as superior and another as inferior. An anti-racist, on the other hand, promotes equality and justice across all races and seeks positive discrimination to even out the playing field. To become an anti-racist, we must unlearn how we have been taught to see the world, our conditioning and socialization, the historical myths of Canada. To dismantle racism, learn to be an ally and work towards becoming an accomplice. This next slide defines an ally as someone who advocates for groups or individuals who do not come from the same place of privilege as the ally. It is considered to be one of the first steps in race and social justice work. An accomplice encompasses the allyship, but it goes beyond to advocacy. They use their privilege to continue challenging existing conditions at the risk of their own comfort and well-being. They focus more on dismantling the structures that oppress. You are challenging and working towards dismantling racism when you speak up, when you hear someone spouting ignorant crap, especially if it's a friend or a family member. Call it out. There comes a time when silence is a betrayal. Martin Luther King. Never allow the safe space that you inhibit to provide a safe place for bigotry. Vote for, campaign for, or donate to the campaigns of candidates who belong to minority groups. You can promote diversity, equity, and inclusion for better representation. Share art and published works that are written from people in a minority group. Take risks and don't be afraid to be uncomfortable, because there will be times when you are. All of us need to feel like we have a place where we belong, where we are important, where people care about us, where we feel like we contribute. We are vulnerable people. And we know that racism can be impacted by violating human rights on the grounds such as color, ethnic origin, place of origin, religion, and ancestry or creed. We know to further complicate a situation, racism can overlap or intersection with other human rights grounds such as age, sex, disability, sexual orientation, marital or family status, generic characteristics, or a conviction where a pardon has been granted to create a unique or compound a situation. Our individual cultures and beliefs are recognized, and these rights are protected under the Human Rights Act, yet we still experience this world of unrest. We need to have a greater understanding. So let's talk about cultural awareness. Cultural is the characteristic and knowledge of a particular group of people, encompassing language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and arts. There are three aspects to cultural awareness. Cultural consciousness can be defined as the process of developing awareness of culture in oneself, which can result in expanding understanding and developing deeper cultural knowledge about others. Cultural in this practice is understood as the set of shared attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors are determined by culture that in turn influences our teaching and learning practices. Culture is unconscious, it's taught, and basic culture patterns are set by the age of 2. Culture and race are influential factors in schools and society. And as ethnic, racial, and cultural diversity increase in our society, it is of utmost importance to address this issue. Cultural competence is loosely defined as the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from different cultures or belief systems that are different from one's own. This term describes an individual's recognition, respect, and tolerance that they demonstrate towards other cultures, including their own culture and those cultures that are not represented in their environment. So there are 5 elements of cultural competence. Number 1, open attitude. Number 2, self-awareness. 3, awareness of other. 4, cultural knowledge. And 5, cultural skills. So once you understand and appreciate people's cultural backgrounds, then you can also connect with them more. I watched a video that was created from a TED Talks clip by Nina Fombo titled, "No, You Cannot Touch My Hair." She did a study on this everyday microaggression that Black women experience. Many find it an offensive, unwanted touch that we experience. So I encourage you to have a watch of that video. It's by Nina Fombo and it's titled, "No, You Cannot Touch My Hair." And I brought that up because a lot of people, some people didn't realize that it is an issue, and it is an issue. So watch that video. It was quite funny, I thought. So the next page we have are the 5 tips from the American Psychological Association to be more culturally aware. The first one is to think beyond race and ethnicity. A person's culture is shaped by more than the color of their skin or the way that they dress. It is shaped by the person's life experiences and traditions, which may be seen or unseen to the naked eye. Learn by asking. That's the second thing. Don't be afraid to ask questions. People feel respected and appreciated when you take a genuine interest in who they are. So ask open-ended questions about their culture to learn more. The third is to make local connections. Find local organizations or venues that work with a cultural group that you're interested in, like advocacy groups, religious institutions, colleges, or social clubs. I'm a member of the National Congress of Black Women Foundation, and it's an organization that has championed the interests of Black women and their families for the last 25 years. Anna Marie reached out to her connection, and that's why I'm here today. The fourth tip is to pay attention to nonverbal behaviors, meaning body language can sometimes differ based on cultural norms. Pay attention to how your body language is being perceived by those around you. Another example would have been from Len's talk yesterday with the Aboriginal students when being disciplined or they don't give the eye contact. That's not disrespectful. It's a sign of respect. So that was very another thing about paying attention to nonverbal behaviors. And the fifth is to exchange stories. Storytelling is a great way to share experiences that go way beyond culture. So initiate an open conversation by sharing a personal story. I've injected a few personal stories that I hope created interest and added some value to the education of my presentation here today. I hope that it helped us connect. So what can we do to build cultural bridges? Well, for starters, don't allow cultural differences to become the basis for criticism and judgments. Awareness of other cultures is 50% of the solution. The first skill to intercultural competence is to suspend judgment. Look at the situation without emotion. Ask yourself, could this be a cultural misunderstanding? Remember the platinum rule, which is treat others the way they want to be treated. Building cultural capacity is building relationships with people different than yourself. It is a conscious awareness of the impact of one's actions, words, and intentions on others. And finally, cultural capacity is a continuous acknowledge of one's responsibility to ease the experience of others. Cultural humility is being aware and challenging your own biases to develop and maintain respectful processes and relationships based on mutual trust. According to scholastic writers, Turvalon and Murray Garcia, 1998, there are 3 features of cultural humility. Number 1, it is a lifelong process of self-reflection and critique. cultural humility involves humbly acknowledging oneself as a learner when it comes to understanding another's experience. 2, there is a desire to fix imbalance, being aware and challenging your own cultural biases. And the 3rd is cultural humility aspires to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others, recognizing the failures of the past. Researchers, clinicians, providers, and advocates can all contribute to building a better future that is founded in practices of cultural humility. So I'm going to share one more story with you about an incident that took place in Vancouver last year. That was with retired Judge Selwyn Romley. He was detained and handcuffed by the Vancouver Police Department as he was on his regular morning walk along a beach. The police were looking for someone that was half his age. Judge Romley was the 4th Black law student to attend UBC's Allard School of Law, graduating in 1966. In 1974, he became the first Black provincial court judge working out of Terrace. And then in 1978, he was transferred to Burnaby. 1991, he was voted by BC lawyers as one of the 4 best provincial judges. In 1995, he was appointed to the Supreme Court. So can you imagine how he must have felt to be so wrongly or so ignorantly mistaken? Did you know that 47 years earlier, his brother, Valmont, was also handcuffed and arrested by Vancouver Police Department, who were looking for someone that looked nothing like him? When he told the officers it wasn't him and that he was a lawyer, they laughed at him. The good, however wrong, that came from the retired judge's incident was the $225,000 that was donated for Black students to attend UBC's Allard School of Law. So they had $225,000 in scholarships. So comparing the profiling and these results from 2021 to 47 years ago, it's obvious systemic racism still exists in Vancouver. Even today with our children, imagine the face of an elementary school student when they realize that no one wants to sit with them or play with them because of how they look or sound. It can be heartbreaking for that child, to say the least, let alone perhaps influence the choices that they make as they go through life. We need to be more aware. We need to be more conscious. We need to do better. In Telling on Racism, Leanne Bell believes the struggle to eliminate racism requires a constant focus on how race operates and requires clear-sightedness about the role race plays to provide tools that are necessary to develop strategies to dismantle racism. She believes that a racial consciousness is more honest and effective and a more hopeful alternative to racial blindness. Bell believes that only a race-conscious approach will provide better analytical tools, and it offers a more promising framework for envisioning a racially just future. We must look back to move forward. white privilege exists. It stems from colonization and societal beliefs. And as a society, we must all work together to eradicate racial inequality and social injustices. We must all work together to change the cycle. The only thing getting in the way of us creating a world where human diversity is celebrated, equality a no-brainer, and inclusion a way of life is commitment, is imagination and commitment. Susan Renderly. Naveen, I will bring this back to you to facilitate our question and answer period.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what we'll do here, many Candace on the side chat have just been reflecting on how powerful and rich this conversation has been, and to give space for some of that reflection and process as you're thinking about questions for Candace, we're actually going to ask our graphic artist to come forward and maybe share her visual drawing at this point, which will give individuals just a little bit more time if there's any questions or thoughts that they might have that I could pose to Candace. So Adriana, if you want to share your piece, and we'll be monitoring the chat on the side for further questions.
Sounds great. I'm gonna see if I can, okay, I cannot share my screen, so I'm going to make my camera bigger. There we go. So yesterday I had the absolute pleasure to spend time with Candace talking. So that gave me a bit of a starting point for getting started with this work. And today I was able to listen with a bit more ease. So I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be here with all of you today, to be part of this conversation that, as Candace was saying, is an ongoing conversation. This is work that doesn't stop. It's not like a one-time, you're gonna resolve all the issues in the world. This is something that we're gonna have to keep on working on. And things are going to continue evolving, but it requires a lot of stamina and commitment from all of us. So the way I structured this drawing, it has the three figures at the center, looking back, looking forward, and right in the middle, looking at where we are right now. So rooting ourselves in the present. So on the left side, I have that figure that is kind of trapped in this small box. That is how I see racism, discrimination, and injustices functioning in society, where it reduces people's ability to live their lives to the fullest. It restricts mobility in every form, physical, economic, social. It erases who people are as full humans, and it denies basic rights. So I have some of the examples that were given around the Jim Crow laws, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Indian Act, and all this very strong and very damaging institutional structures that are the base of the nation where we live. So at the bottom, you can see there is colonialism and racism and how they're interconnected, and they affect every aspect of life. So Candace was talking about the medical experimentations, and also how it affects the legal system and over policing of people who are racialized, lack of access to safe spaces, to be able to immigrate if you're escaping war or other situations. But from there, I also wanted to uplift that at the same time there is resistance, and resistance is also part of our history from individual and also collective actions. So the anti-war movements, the fights that unions have fought that are often related also with racial justice, civil rights movements, and many more actions that are also important to uplift, so that we're not feeling defeated, because we know there's a lot of people who have started this fight, and we're here to continue it. At the center is this call to speak out, to not go back into the sense of comfort or fear, and it requires bravery, but it also requires a lot of self-reflection of where we stand, who we are, and what are our intentions and our impacts, with the ongoing importance of dismantling those systems that we know are there and affects us, but we are also, by not questioning them, we are continuing the discrimination, the racism, and all the systems of oppression. And here on the right, I have just the invitation to move from being an ally to being an accomplice, to promoting justice, equity, human rights. And then at the bottom here, you can see a small figure with some ripples going out from the personal actions to family, friends, colleagues, community, city, region, and it starts to expand. So to not feel that our smaller actions don't have a say, like even if you make someone's day by recognizing or uplifting their humanity, that's gonna make a change. Like what Candace was saying too, around like how children are being, how are they experiencing the world? So with a small action, you can completely transform someone's life. And then on the right side, there's some stuff that I still have to finish writing here, but the reminder that is not only enough to not be racist, that we must all be anti-racist, because we're not just witnesses of the injustices, we're actively moving forward to change that. So I included some of the quotes that I found very, very kind of action driven. So action is the only remedy to indifference, which was at the beginning, but also that reminder of treating others the way they want to be treated, because we can't assume that people want to be treated the way we want to be treated. So creating a strong, sincere and honest, generous relationships are also going to help us move forward. I think I'll leave it there. I am so very inspired and honored and so happy to start the day this way. Thank you again for all the organizers for including visuals into this event as well.
Right, thank you, Adriana. What a capture of the rich conversation, and the side chat is just a buzz, Candace, just with the depth and the level of presentation and the richness and the grounding factor as well of the presentation. As we begin our conversation at this stage, we'll kind of go into some of the questions that have come first. And I have to say, Candace, that through the story of your ancestors and their resilient spirit, you really brought to life just that systemic aspect of discrimination and racism and how it's embedded. And I think what really spoke out, for me when I was listening to you, was that as somebody who was in grade 3, when you moved to a new place, you felt it. You didn't know what it was, but you felt it. And then when you spoke of just how it's woven into your history and woven in through all of those key points of the beginnings of nations to where we're at now, and that just brought it forward. One of the questions that came up in the chat here was a question around the use of language. And the question is, please help me understand why not to use marginalized. We still use this when we talk about racialized people, of which I am one. We have both been disfranchised and marginalized. So it's around the usage of shifting from marginalized to racialized.
Thank you so much for that question. I believe marginalized versus racialized, marginalized already in itself, that is oppressing. I'm not sure exactly how to marginalize. It's a form of oppression as well. You're being reduced. So racialized is we are of different races, not marginalized.
Yes.
It's reducing. I believe that that term in itself, marginalized.
Yes, and just that piece that you're adding, right? It's less than being the keynote of difference as opposed to racialized, right? The next question that came forward, and this is more of a conversational item, and it's trending a little bit on our side chat here. It's around the use of, again, language of positive discrimination. So the question that was asked was, I always associate the word discrimination with negative emotions. And so I find it hard to think about a term like positive discrimination. In your perspective, Candace, what does this term mean to you and how do you see it?
That's an excellent question. I like the positive discrimination because it's taking it and it's turning it around. We know that discrimination is, we need to do things to level the playing field. Positive discrimination would be that. For an example, I made that decision to revitalize the Junior Black Achievement Awards. That is positive discrimination because it is only for the Black youth. But we see through history, systemic, institutional, our youth need that. They need that advantage. And so that would be an example of positive discrimination. Another one would be the National Congress of Black Women Foundation. They are specifically there to help Black women and their families. So I would say that's examples of positive discrimination. We have to do this to level the playing field, to create a world of equity. It must be done.
And Candace, it links back to what you were saying earlier around the differences between equality and equity.
Yeah.
And if we go to equity, sometimes we need to be able to lift where lifting is needed to create that opportunity. And I just love those examples that you're using of two things that are happening here within our community to be able to provide that positive discrimination.
You know, there is diversity and inclusion. You can have diversity on a board without having the inclusion. And I think where that comes from is the tokenism. Having someone there, but not really inviting their opinions. They're just there as a token, not making any significant contribution, being stifled. We just want you there to say that we've got some representation on the board. So you can have diversity on a board, for an example, without having that inclusion.
That's right. That's right. And I think that also really echoes with what you were saying even earlier around the piece of that genuine part, paying that interest, listening, opening up the ears, unlearning through language. You know, in relation to that, there's another question that had come forward, and it's in term to BIPOC. And the question or the reflection here is, while the term BIPOC most definitely has its flaws, can it in some ways be valuable in creating solidarity and unity when looking at the fight for social justice?
I think that you can have solidarity without lumping racialized people in a group. You look at the civil rights movement, how many different organizations came together for the good of all. We are racialized people. There's no need to say BIPOC. We are racialized people, and we all have our individual issues. We all have the need to form together, you know, but I just do not. When I first heard that term BIPOC, I thought, who created that? You know, that's the first thing. And then I started to do my research on what it's all about and what it means. And my first impressions were correct. I don't want to be a BIPOC. I am not a BIPOC. I'm either Black or I am racialized. I'm also Indigenous in there too, but I'm not a BIPOC. It's just another way of lumping, categorizing racialized people, and it's just not right. It needs to stop. Decolonizing, you know, it has to stop. So I'm so against the word BIPOC.
I know, and you shifted my mindset in it as well too. Is that once, you know, hearing the piece on the lumping, bringing everybody to have the same experiences, it's not what we are fighting towards. It's not what we're unifying towards. It's that recognition. And it was just themed throughout your dialogue and your conversation of, you know, paying attention to the nuances, taking the time to dismantle the experiences of individuals within cultures, within the system at hand. And, you know, as we're having a conversation around language seems to be where a lot of people, I think, are doing what we're doing right now, Candace. They're playing with these words that they've heard or things that they've seen that are out, and really questioning based on our conversation today. There is just a question, a reflection, just to get your insight on reverse racism, a term that is being used, that is bundled around by folks from different dominant culture who want to play victim. Just your thoughts around that word.
Reverse racism. What's that? Either it's racism, or it's not. Reverse racism sounds, maybe it's coming from a place of defensiveness to me. I don't acknowledge it, because what is reverse racism? Either it's racism or it's not. So where did that come from and why? Is it a deflect? You know, again, it's so, yeah, I don't, what is reverse racism? What is that? That would be my answer to that question.
And I love how you're encouraging us to question these concepts. You mentioned it even earlier. The only way we're going to unlearn pieces is question, bring those voices forward, be okay to question concepts and thoughts that we've had, because they've come at us in different ways, and we need to be able to take that time and maybe even stand in our own thoughts to be able to really think about what some of the language is that is around us. I have a reflection here as well too, when it talks about you know, innocence and white fragility. And this is a reflection that came forward around, it's very, that piece and conversation was very helpful and important. And this speaker mentioned it's also good to have compassion for our fragile white friends, some of whom are open to learning and becoming allies. Hopefully the goal is inclusivity for all. That's that reflection piece. I know when we were at that stage of the dialogue today, that is the hardest one for me to dismantle, because it comes with such a guise of, it's that subtlety to the, oh, well, where are you from? Or have you always been? It's just hidden, or your name is very interesting. All of those pieces is always hidden with a smile. So it's very difficult to dismantle. Yeah. The hardest at times. Thoughts that you might have around that piece?
I was, my mind just went to another place that I thought maybe, I think I'll be okay to talk about. It's quite emotional for me, and so I've it's emotional for us to talk about racism, and it's very traumatic. And I lost my mother in 2019. She was 92 years old. My mother was a single parent. She raised 8 girls and 1 boy, and we all have the same father, but bad dad, whatever. Anyway, so my mother's a very, very strong individual. I am my mother's daughter. I think out of all the 9 kids, it's me. But she had a stroke and she went into the hospital. And she's a very strong woman. And my niece called it a grandma moment. Okay, grandma had her moment, as I was called in Vancouver. And basically, the nurses were trying to, help my mother rehab, because she had a stroke. So she wasn't completely paralyzed, but she had trouble moving one side. Anyway, the long and the short is after, I don't know, maybe a month and a half, she was tired. She couldn't do it anymore. And so the nurse was saying to her, Mrs. Brown, you've got to try. And my niece Tammy was there. She said, Grams looked at that lady and said, I am 92 years old. I have raised 8 girls and 1 boy. Never in my life have I not tried. I'm tired. She was done. She was done. And then shortly after that is when I started to get some pictures of how my mother was being treated, because she couldn't move all the way on one side, but I guess because she told them she was tired, they gave up on her. They would put her in a chair. My mother never sat up in a chair all day long, okay? They would put her in a chair before the meals, and then, take them away after, but she would be left there for some time. And I've gotten pictures where Tammy would come in and she's sleeping, can't get up. It's terrible. And it really hurt me. And it felt, again, is this medicine's dismissing her? How are you forgetting her? But perhaps it could be anybody's mother's. But I just think in terms of what a very hard life she's had and being forgotten about. I had to phone that administrator on the floor and I let her know this is not acceptable. Like, I'm in Vancouver, please don't make me quit my job and come there. And I sent her pictures. This is not right. So again, it just reminded me of how medicine might disregard, the care of racialized people. So she was a wonderful, strong woman. I am like her, but yeah, in the ending, I felt she had no dignity, no respect. And once she left that hospital and went into a care facility, she passed within 6 weeks. And it's very, very heartbreaking, but I learned a lot, and I know that she would be very proud of what I'm doing today. Very, very proud. So.
Well, and as you're talking, Daphne Wu as well too is expressing the same, that she deserves so much more dignity. And just those words, Candace, like, I'm tired. And I think at some place there was another comment that was made by an audience member in terms of an incident in which they themselves were a racialized individual who was asked, I was once asked to justify whether my friends could use the N-word or not. I'm African and I hadn't a clue. I don't know what they expected of me, but I always regret not having used it as a teachable moment. And for me, when I hear you tell your story about, we're tired of having to explain, tired to having to fight, tired to think that every moment is a teachable moment, and then living in that pain afterwards, thinking, why didn't I should have, and I could have. And, there's so many stages when we come to that final piece. But I do see the power of your ancestors in you, and it's almost like that flame that started, I just so value that part of the story, because it's like that flame just passed from one generation to the next generation. And Candace, maybe that's what it takes. It's not the burden of one, it's the burden of all, and it's the burden of ongoing work that we are going to dismantle together individually, because we have those different experiences of the impact of colonization, but collectively together, if we're working towards the same parts. I'm just looking here. There is another question I want to add on here. And this is a question that is, again, just asking for any thoughts or recommendations. What would you recommend to people working within organizations who see anti-racism work as being too political?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, Candace. I'm with you. I know, yes. And we've heard that we've heard organizations sometimes don't want to take that step forward.
Yeah. And it's a problem, and it's very disheartening. It hurts. It kind of the reason why I chose to make this presentation as I did is because we have to understand where we came from. And if organizations, maybe those leaders don't understand where we came from, it's all about education. It really is. And that's organizations are institutional, though it all starts with education, and that's what companies need to do. They need to, one of the things that I'm going to be doing as a member of the National Anti-Racism Working Group for the Steelworkers is for that next convention, I'm putting a motion on the floor that all of the executive needs to go through anti-racism training. That would be a start of total inclusiveness, because anti-racism work starts at the top and it works its way down. Everyone has to buy into it, and it's about education. So if it isn't happening at the top, not much chance that it's going to happen down below. So we need to make those changes, and that's one way I'm going to is make that motion that the leadership of the different units, locals, they all need to go through anti-racism training, because they're leaders. They need to lead in inclusive diversity, everything. They have to. So yeah. Oh, someone was a steelworker.
Yeah, I see that. There's a steelworker here, and there's also the niece of Honorable Selwyn Romley. His niece is also present here. Leah mentioned that those are her uncles. But
awesome. Now there was just one other thing I wanted to just add is as far as union goes, Warren Williams, he's actually president of QP15. That's my cousin. And so he does a lot of work in this. And like I said, unions have been the basis of that civil and human rights movement, and it's in our blood. So yeah, I saw there was another QP person there, and I just wanted to mention Warren. I guess he's on a second round. So very proud.
It's perfect. It comes back to those connections you talked about. Connections create that unifying. There's one last question, I think, as people were muddling with just language in terms. A question that came up was, is disenfranchised also a reducing concept?
Disenfranchised. I kind of thought about that, and I thought in terms of it being more like disconnected. I took it more in terms of that way versus reducing or marginalizing. Just not, they're disconnected. And it could be from no fault of their own. It could be just the way that society is, but I take disenfranchised more as disconnected than being whittled down to nothing.
I value that, because for me, as a visual person, it really creates a bit of clarity around that, that disconnection versus that reduction of that lesser than. Candace, we could go on for days, I'm sure, but we were coming to a close, and I have to just say the chat is just lit up with emojis, just comments on just how powerful this has been, how enlightening the presentation has been. I think I've gained so much vocabulary and ways of looking at anti-racism work. There's been requests for sharing your presentation internally within their own systems, and we will be having this being put onto our website for individuals to watch and to share within their internal pieces. I am going to ask Anna Maria to come forward at this time, and maybe Candace, you could lead us to a close. I want to thank you for all of your wisdom today. It's continuing our dialogue and our conversation, and that spirit is getting stronger. I can feel it. I can just feel it rushing through myself here as well too. Anna Maria, if you would like to lead us through a close.
I would like to express my biggest appreciation to you, Candace, for the presentation, for your willingness to step out, do this kind of work, and also for sharing your knowledge with everybody. I think that we all are in that process of learning and learning and learning. We would never stop learning if we're really open our eyes and we really want to make a change in this world. I think that everybody who participated today, who has been coming to these sessions, it's in that piece, understanding that we all have a role to play. I think it's the most valuable. So people is asking if I share your email, you just share your email with everybody. So just to confirm, everybody will be receiving a copy of your presentation along with your email so that they can access directly to you. Thank you, Naveen, for moderating this session. Thank you to Junoen, who has been supporting us with the technical pieces. And thank you to the other LIPs, the North Shore LIPs, the Surrey LIP, and the Tri-Cities LIP, because without them, we couldn't have been very successful like we have been in these last 2 days. So thank you very much for everything. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful day. We'll just keep connecting, and I hope to see you tomorrow and for the rest of the session, that we have wonderful presentations for the rest of the week. So have a good day, everybody.